Good afternoon, everyone. I truly hope you've been able to take advantage of the great educational programming that's part of Global Pet Expo's new Global Learning Series. I want to welcome each of you to this afternoon's NielsenIQ education session titled How 2020 Changed the Pet Landscape. What's next? So, whether this is your first or your last session of today, we truly appreciate you sharing part of your afternoon with us. My name is Brad Boldridge, and I'm part of a dynamic pet vertical at NielsenIQ that supports our pet clients. My role within the vertical is to work closely in supporting our neighborhood pet retailers. I'm pleased to be here with Sam Smith, who works really hard supporting our manufacturer clients. Sam brings a wealth of knowledge and has been with NielsenIQ for 4 years, servicing various clients within the CPG industry. I will get us started this afternoon by providing an overview of the changing pet landscape in 2020. I will then turn the floor over to Sam, who will close out the presentation by providing you with our perspective on what to expect from the pet category in 2021. So let's talk about 2020. 2020 was definitely a year like no other we've seen in a while. It was most definitely a year of change for the pet category. But first, I think we can all agree that 2020 was a year packed full of change, even for each of us. So as we made our New Year's resolutions and we watched the ball drop on January 1st, I'm pretty sure most of our plans for 2021 did not include dealing with a global pandemic. And we certainly weren't envisioning wearing face masks for most of the year. Talk about change. I mean, how about $22.1 billion? This is the projected size of the face mask market for 2021. Just for perspective, this market was only $737 million in 2019. Now, that's a lot of projected change. So, one more change that most of us probably weren't expecting in 2020, and that would be the great toilet tissue crisis. The green line here on this chart represents the highest sales point of the previous year. You can see very few periods in 2020 on the black line that actually fell below prior year sales for this category. So toilet tissue is one of those categories that was pretty strong throughout, other than just a little bit of a dip that it had, but for the whole year over year, very strong. So enough about us. How about the changes for the pet category? Let's talk about that. So last year, we were all gathered in person for Global Pet Expo before all of the COVID-19 shutdowns began. March Madness, that used to be reserved for the NCAA tournament, but it kind of took on a whole new meaning last year as shoppers reacted to the news of a global pandemic by loading their pantries full of the items they needed most. And that was truly madness. The result was a long period of supply chain challenges and out of stocks that were saw across the industry. We did see more and more pet adoptions in 2020, which was a great thing. Now, by mid-year, there were reports of record high online purchases for the pet category, as pet parents shifted their behavior in response to the pandemic. In response, we saw many of our pet retailers really ramping up their efforts to ensure shoppers had access to home delivery or curbside delivery fulfillment options at their local pet store. And then ending the year, we have DCM. So by November, the FDA made their announcement that there was no evidence linking grain-free pet food to DCM. Let's unpack a few of these milestones, beginning with the rise in pet adoptions. So I thought it only fitting just to highlight a few of the insights that were part of APPA's pet ownership during the pandemic study that was released last year. So overall, the study found that pet ownership continued to rise despite the current pandemic. In fact, most pet parents said their ownership situation had not changed. We saw new pet ownership among 9% of the survey respondents. And although half of the respondents said they were concerned about their finances. Nearly three-quarters of those said they did not plan to make changes to their pet's diet despite their financial situation, which proving, as we know, one thing that did not change in 2020 was pet parents' commitment to ensuring the best nutrition possible for their pets. So another one of our 2020 changes, pantry loading. Here is a look at the monthly brick and mortar pet food sales in 2020. And you'll see here where you see a huge spike is during the month of March, where we found 24% growth in dollar sales versus a year ago. Of course, that spike is a part of the March Madness I was talking about. And that spike was then followed by, of course, a large decline in April and a slow recovery over the next several months while pet parents work through their inventory. However, as we know, the pet category is absolutely resilient and it made its way back to positive growth trends by midsummer and finished the year very, very strong. One quick note here that this was not the trend in most of our non-pet or durable categories who actually experienced growth throughout the pandemic. So much like the toilet tissue example that I shared earlier, they didn't have to really come back. It was more of a continued trend that they saw throughout the pandemic. So shoppers responded in 2020 in a large way by spending 46% more dollars online for pet food versus prior year. E-commerce pet food and treat sales for 2020 hit $9.4 billion, making e-com larger than pet specialty brick and mortar and increasing the share of pet food and treats for e-com from what was 21% in 2019 to 27% in 2020. We saw mainstream retail, which is going to be your grocery, your mass, your club, your dollar, your military. This channel is still the largest pet food sector with nearly half of the category sales. And it actually had a healthy growth last year of 3%. When it came to pet specialty finished the year down 1.5% versus prior year. Now, keep in mind that on a monthly basis, the last 4 months of the year, we actually saw a lot of increases happening in pet specialty. So just year over year, mainly because of that decline that happened after pantry loading and the build back, that's why it was down for the year. But month over month, actually really good growth coming out of 2020 and walking into 2021. So let's dig a little bit deeper into this e-com growth, and let's look at it at a product type or at a segment level. So here you can see a 3-year look at online sales growth. And you can see that e-commerce growth really occurred not only just at the total pet food level, where sales were up 47% versus a year ago, but online sales increased versus prior year happened for dry food, it happened for wet food, and it happened for treats. So obviously dry food's going to see the largest absolute dollar growth since that's the largest segment here. And treats had the benefit of seeing the largest or the strongest trend overall in terms of growth. So here on this slide, I wanted to just kind of give you a bit of perspective with the help from our NielsenIQ household panel. We were able to take a look at where the portion of e-commerce sales attributed to volume shifting actually came from. So we found that 40% of e-com's growth was the result of shifting activities. Of that 40% in shifted volume that e-com received, we found that mainstream and pet specialty channels shifted the most volume to e-commerce. 46% of the shifted volume came from mainstream, and 43% of the shifted volume actually came from pet specialty. That's a question we get quite a bit. So it's good here to actually confirm with our panel that there's definitely been shifting to e-com coming from both of those places. So finally, throughout 2020, we heard at the end of the year from the FDA that there was no direct correlation between DCM and pet food. Unfortunately, the pet food category had been dealing with this issue since the middle of 2018, and not surprising, over 2 years later, there was going to be a great impact. Here on the left is a look at grain-free dry dog food trends, in brick and mortar pet. So that's both your specialty and your mainstream. And on the right is a look at grain inclusive dry dog food trends. So you can see on the left that total grain free, and that's your green line, it continues to decline and has been since June of 2018. The gray line right underneath represents those brands that were named in the investigation. So they have been on a steady decline since June 2018 until the last half of 2020 for those name brands. Now, sales in the second half of 2020, they still decline, but that continuous decline that was happening, it stopped. And you see a little bit of an uptick at the latest trend of the year. So we'll kind of see how that goes coming to 2021. Meanwhile, on the right side, the total grain inclusive dry dog food trends, which is again your green line, these were actually down 5% at the start of the investigation, but they managed to achieve a positive 3% growth by the end of 2019. And then those sales did slow in 2020. But however, keep in mind that 2020 introduced the pandemic that was present, and with all the changes it brought, this was also going to have an impact. So we may see those trends start to reverse as we go into 2021. But just that gives you a pretty good idea that still, the impacts that happen because of the FDA investigation on grain-free, we're just starting to see a slight bit of uptick just with the brands that were named, but we're going to have to keep watching this and see where it goes. So certainly there was an impact. And so again, one of the questions that we get a lot is about, can we see where there's actually volume shifting coming from grain-free products and going into grain inclusive. And so we did take a look at our NielsenIQ panel just to see if we could see any shifting of volume from grain-free to grain inclusive dry dog food. And we absolutely did. We saw a 19% shift in volume from grain-free dry dog food over to grain inclusive. So as you can see, 2020 was definitely a busy year for pet. Now, I'm going to turn it over to Sam, who will focus on 2021 and sharing our thoughts on what's in store for pet in 2021 from a NielsenIQ perspective. Sam?
Thanks, Brad. I definitely agree with your metaphor there of March Madness. It definitely was a crazy year last year. To think that a year ago today, a lot of us would have been landing on Orlando and meeting in the conference halls for Global Pet. As Brad pointed out, we're going to take a look now at what we're expecting in 2021 based off of some trends. A large portion of the ingredient claims that we're seeing are these small pockets that are really growing strong across pet food in 2020. Some of the larger categories that we see, like a natural claim that you would have on pack, $5.6 billion, is about 2/3 of all pet food across pet specialty carries that claim, but it's declining at 6%. And what's very interesting is that we see from the rest of the claims on this wheel chart, your fresh refrigerated or your frozen, freeze-dried, dehydrated, and meal enhancers or toppers, is that all of them, while much smaller in size for dollar volume, are growing very strong. Refrigerated up over 20%, frozen 14%, freeze-dried 7%, dehydrated almost 11% growth, and then meal enhancers up 6%. And these claims are really what's driving the trends across pet food. And the price premiumization is where we're seeing the focus there. When you look at your natural, the price per pound is $3.12. So that's about the average amount across the pet food portfolio. When you look at the other 5 claims here on the wheel chart, all of them have a much higher price per pound, especially freeze-dried. That's almost $32.50 per pound. So not only are these more premium claims and more premium products, but they're actually driving growth, indicating a shift in consumers actually seeking out these products, whether they're the full and complete meal that's being fed to their pets, or it's being added as a topper or an additive to provide nutrition supplements. Definitely leading towards higher margins for manufacturers and retailers who are making and stocking these type of products. When we narrow down the scope to look at wet food, so both dog and cat combined, but now we're just seeing wet, so no dry and no treats, we see again that fresh and frozen is really what's driving growth for the category. Shelf stable is over $1 billion and growing at about a 1.5% rate, so doing well. But fresh refrigerated at 69 million is growing 20%, and frozen at 225 million is growing at 14%. So both of those, again, seeing a much higher growth trend across 2020. And again, when we see the price per pound, your shelf stable average price is about $3.50, $3.60 per pound. Fresh refrigerated is $5.38, and frozen is more than double at $6.24. So again, the mentality of premiumization is not driving consumers away from these type of products and these type of claims. They're actually seeking these out. The next slide that we're going to look at here comes from our NielsenIQ home scan panel. This is a very cool report called a buyer overlap, where it takes the unique households that purchase different categories, and it also looks at the households that purchase multiple categories. When we're looking at the charts, the one on the left is looking at a total universe of dog food and treats, so total dog, everything combined. And on the right, the same for cat food and treats. You'll notice that there's a circle for wet, dry, and treats on each. So those are your exclusive buyers. So what this is telling us is that 11% of households that purchase a dog food or treat product are exclusive to dry food, meaning they don't purchase wet and they don't purchase treats. And the same for cat food, we see that wet is 7%, meaning that 7% of the households that purchase a cat food product are exclusive to that wet food. What's interesting here and where we're seeing the trend alignment is that middle portion are consumers or households that purchase all three. They purchase a wet food product, a dry product, and a treat product throughout the year. And that makes up a third of all households, 30% for dog and 34% for cat. So really showing the power of those multiple product category purchases and how consumers are filling their baskets with again, a variety of offers. So no longer is it just you feed your dog dry food and that's it. Now you have treats, you have wet food, different supplements that can be added. And I think anecdotally, for myself, this makes a lot of sense. For dog food, we see a skewing towards dry and treats. You can see 29% of all households purchase just dry and treats with no wet, and 30% buy dry treats and wet. For both of our dogs, we feed them dry food and we have tons of treats in our pantry, but we really don't have very many wet products. When you look at the cat Venn diagram, you see a different story. It skews towards wet and dry. And again, that makes sense. For our cat, who we actually rescued, talking about the pet adoption trend, we rescued her at the end of 2020. We see that we feed her wet food and we also feed her crunchers, and then occasionally we'll give her treats. So we're skewing more towards that side. And what's really impressive when you extrapolate these to a volume threshold is we find that the 30% of buyers that purchase at least one of each of the products make up over 50% of all the dollar volume. So really a very valuable household to be, in the sense that they over-index their household weight with how much they're purchasing. And for cat food, it's even more drastic. 34% of households purchase one of each product, and 63% of the dollars are attributed to that. So essentially 1/3 of the households are making up 2/3 of the dollar for cat, and 1/3 of the households are making up 50% of the dollars for dog.
That could be an interesting opportunity, Sam, especially for some of our retailer partners, as they really take a look at what type of opportunity there lies within both dog and cat to really get purchasing across dry, wet, and treats. From a promotional standpoint, might be a great opportunity to start thinking about how do you really entice those dry buyers to pick up a wet and pick up a treat product, so you could really bring those numbers up.
Absolutely. I was just going to say there's a huge promotional opportunity here for those products. I think there's been longstanding a mentality that if you make dry food or if you make wet food, there's a barrier in between and you're trying to get consumers to fall on one side or the other. But truthfully, a lot of consumers are categorical in how they're purchasing. And I think that makes sense when we think about what we do for grocery shopping. A lot of people, you cross categories, you cross different things, you're willing to try new products. Promotions are more often than not a huge driver of why we see trial for new products in the market. So as goes for humans, so goes for pets. That's usually what we see with most trends. So it makes sense that that's what we're seeing here. Brad already touched on how explosive e-com was in 2020. I think we all know that e-com was already on a growth path, and then COVID really accelerated that, whether it was consumers not wanting to expose themselves out in stores or states initiating lockdowns, e-com really got a boost from the COVID-19 impact of 2020. We see on a quarterly basis for total pet food that in 2019, it was about 1.5 to just under 2 million throughout the year. And then in 2020, it didn't have a single quarter under 2 billion, which is absolutely incredible that it continued that growth pace. And it ended the year just under $3 billion for e-com, which is absolutely massive. And what's interesting in terms of a forecast is right now it's mid-March, so we don't quite have the full quarter yet. But when we look at January and February's data, we see that we're already at $1.8 billion for the quarter. So if you compare that back to 2019, this quarter, only 2 months of it has already made up as much sales as Q4 of 2019, which was the largest quarter of the entire year 2 years ago. So e-com definitely seeing those accelerated growth trends. When we look at private label over the past few years, full year 2018 through 2020, we broke it up into the same views that Brad had mentioned earlier. Your mainstream, think of your food, drug, mass, club retailers, and then your pet specialties, so our specific pet retail accounts. We see that the vast majority of private label volume does come from mainstream. And while it grew in 2019, it was flat in 2020, down about 0.5%, but still well over $2 billion as a brand category. And for pet specialty, we saw that it continued to grow. So it went from a 15% CAGR down to about a 4.5% growth. So while that decelerated in 2020, the overall trend was still positive for private label. And a large part of that for 2020 as an anomaly in a lot of different ways is between the stocking outages or inability to get resources to produce those, or again, several states had to shut down or stores were going out of business or switching to a curbside type of mentality. There was a transition that did hurt private label. And we fully expect in 2021 for it to come back. The fact that the trend was still positive for pet specialty and it was only flat at worst for mainstream shows the resilience of private label. So there's definitely going to be a bounce back in 2021. CBD has been a hot topic in pet for a few years now. Again, as goes for humans, so goes for pets. CBD has been a big deal in the human world. Several products, both edible as well as treatment supplement based, are being launched. And we saw that across total pet. We wanted to look at the entire space of pet care. So this is looking at everything from your supplies like grooming products that might have a CBD claim to pet food and treats that might have a CBD infusion type of nutrition claim, all the way down to treatment. So for our dog, we actually give him a little bit of CBD because he has arthritis and he has trouble sleeping. So that's a supplement that we give him. So all of those combined, we were looking at here. And the total dollar sales are a little over 11.5 million. So pretty small category, especially if you think back to the wheel chart. All of those were in the hundreds of millions. But when you look at the growth rate, this is hands down one of the fastest growing spaces that we're seeing, over 50% growth rate in 2020 alone. And the price per pound, if you think back to freeze dried, it was $32.50 per pound. CBD is at 37.7, so almost $38 per pound. So again, we're seeing a transition towards premiumization. But if consumers find that it validates it, if pet parents find that it validates and it has a driving force for their pet family, their pet kids, then there's a reason to buy it. So that's not staving away consumers to try this. And when we looked at it from a home scan perspective, so looking at our NielsenIQ panelists, we saw that the dollars per trip across all outlets was about $33, which makes sense. Your mainstream, more often than not, is going to be a lower price yield versus pet specialty, especially neighborhood pet is going to be usually a higher price point. And what was interesting is we saw that the trips, this is looking at the average trips where a CBD product was purchased, put in the basket and brought to the register, was a little over 2. So the average consumer who is going to buy a pet CBD is making at least 2 trips a year, with heavy buyers doing more than that. And our repeat rate, meaning people that were converted from trial to repeaters, meaning they purchased at least more than once in a year, was 20%. So 1 out of every 5 households that's going to try a CBD so far has converted over. And while that number's down a little from 2019, it was about 25%. That's still a very high repeat rate for such a new and especially a niche category, and one that definitely has quite a bit of stigma behind it from a historical standpoint.
It fits in so perfectly with everything we've been talking about with all the premiumization. It's just one more opportunity to premiumize the category. And especially the dog pet parents, I think they really
Yeah.
see a lot from the dog treats because there's so many different types with the functional treats that are out there to help you treat hip and joint or whatever conditions you might have. It kind of gives you another option that you could treat your pets
Mhm.
conditions with.
No, I think that's a great point, and it segues into our next slide. So we pulled demographics by these CBD households, so specifically isolating households that were pet owners and purchased CBD products. And what we see, and I'll go through the full list, but they're about in the middle. You see pet ownerships, households that only own a dog, or households that own a dog and a cat, together make up a little over 87% of all households that buy a pet CBD, but make up 95% of the volume. And I think that speaks to what you were saying, Brad. For our
Mhm.
cat, we grow cat grass for her, or we'll buy catnip toys for her. And even though there's a small market for that, it's really not the same for dogs. So we've definitely seen that there's a skewing in the CBD treat space towards canine pet households.
Yes, mine
And when
actually love the calming treats. Calming helps out a lot. So
Yeah, absolutely, and it definitely helps with the marketing to kind of know who you're targeting, and so we wanted
mhm.
to provide this consumer profile for who the key CBD consumers are, and at a high level, really what we're seeing is affluent households, particularly white, who have one or two family members, so usually young couples, no kids yet, but definitely pet parents, and then age 35 to 40, so those young professionals starting to get into the middle age, and then living in prosperous cities and suburbs, which again aligns with what we're seeing from that income. And as I touched on with the dog owning households, what's amazing when you look at the percent households to percent dollars is the percent dollars are even higher. So for an example, the households that have an income of 100K or more make up about 52% of households, but they're making up 64% of all the dollars spent. Households that have either one or two family members make up 73% of those purchasing CBD for their pets, but that attributes
Mm.
to 84% of the volume. So these are very tight knit profiles that are yielding much higher indexes for their volume. They're basically outspending their weight in households when you look at it from a demographic profile standpoint. And I think that aligns with what we're seeing, where the price per pound of CBD was almost $6 more of freeze dried, and freeze dried is one of the highest price per pound type of claims. It would make sense that it would be affluent households living in cities and suburbs that would
Mhm.
be purchasing that. So that definitely aligns with what we're seeing from a scan perspective. And so to close up, we wanted to touch base on really the high level of what we are looking at for 2021. It's definitely, the pet space is a growing and booming industry. There were plenty of mergers and acquisitions last year. Retailers are expanding. Many of you may have heard that Walmart is expanding into an RX division for pets. So pet across the board, everywhere you turn, there's something being invented or something being launched. So it's a great space to be in. And we really wanted to break down today's presentation into three key callouts. So win with new shoppers, with the rising pet ownership and increased pet spend, capturing new pet shoppers and converting them to repeat consumers, as well as galvanizing the dry, wet, and treat overlapping that we were seeing, becomes even more important. E-com is definitely here to stay. Pet food sales in e-com were already growing, but COVID accelerated those trends very significantly. And from what we've seen from subscription-based ordering, suggests a very long-term trend. Focusing on high growth segments, continue to build those shopper awareness and increase purchasing in the emerging high growth categories that we talked in: frozen, freeze dried, meal enhancers, CBD. Those are going to be areas that are going to help margins due to their higher price point, and also help from the Venn diagrams to include treat type products or meal enhancer type products into the households that are already purchasing dry or wet foods for their pet kids. And with that, we'd like to thank you for your time. We hope you have a great rest of your Global Pet Conference. Good luck with your March Madness brackets if they haven't been broken already. And yeah.